Is that okay? Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Yes, thank you for being here, and also, in person and also on the live stream. So, my name is Nasreen Sha'ar. I am a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, and I will be chairing the session today. So this is a book talk by the NOG, organized by the NOG. The NOG is the Netherlands School for Gender Studies, and it's a platform for gender research and teaching by faculty members from various Dutch universities. NOG also organizes lectures by researchers and scholars working in the broad field of gender studies, both nationally and internationally. And this is specifically an initiative by the NOG PhD Council. So today we have a very exciting talk by Dr. Maya Mikdashi, who will speak about her new book. We will also have a response by Dr. Layal Ftouni, who is an assistant professor of gender studies and critical theory at the gender graduate program here at Utrecht University. So the talk will be around 35 minutes, followed by a response by Layal, who will highlight the important interventions that the book stages. And she will present some questions to which Maya will briefly respond. And at last, for the remaining 25 minutes, we will open the floor for questions. So before introducing our speaker, I would like to thank Trude Oorschot and Florien Keistra for all the work that made this event happen. Yeah, I want to say that actually I met Maya in 2009 already, so really long time ago. And we met at the community center of Meme. And Meme is a queer collective in Beirut. So here we are today, 13 years later at Utrecht University. And yeah, I'm very happy to see you again here in a very different context. So today Maya will discuss her brilliant book, Sextarianism, an insightful and urgent piece of work, and a game changer for gender and Middle East studies, as it offers a new way to understand state power, theorizing sex, sexuality, and sect, and how they are entangled, and how they shape and are shaped by law, secularism, and sovereignty. Maya Mikdashi is an associate professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Her first book, Sextarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, published this year by Stanford University Press, theorizes the relationships between sexual difference and political difference, the religious and the secular, and law, bureaucracy, and biopower. Her work is grounded in ethnographic and archival research and has been translated into Arabic, Turkish, French, Spanish, and German. Maya has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the Journal of Palestine Studies, and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. She has also been published in peer-reviewed edited volumes and in public-facing volumes. She is a co-founding editor of Jadariya. So welcome, Maya and Layal, and yeah, thanks a lot for being here, for accepting our invitation. And yes, I give the floor to you, Maya.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on a rainy afternoon. I know there was a bit of delay with technical issues, so thanks for sticking around. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. The NOG, thanks to the department and to Florien for putting up with many transatlantic emails, and to Layal and Nasreen for having this conversation with me. I think it's actually very special to be having this conversation together. I'm very excited about it. And Nasreen mentioned when we met, I was actually starting my PhD research. So those of you doing a PhD, it takes a long time to get to your book. So I'm just about I'm going to I'm going to present on the main sort of parts of the book. And, you know, the more interesting part of this is always the conversation. So please cut me off if I talk too much. So I always like to start by sort of, everybody sees something very different when they see this book cover. This book cover is a sketch done by an artist, a Lebanese artist named Huguette Calon, who had a very sort of interesting life trajectory and career where over decades she painted bodies in multiple different medias. So I saw this actually painting sketch. It's a charcoal sketch when I was in Beirut one day, and it just stopped me in my tracks. When I saw it, it's like sometimes you see something and you just, that's all you can see. So I was very pleased. You know, she died recently, so her daughter gave me permission to use the photo. And the other thing about her that I didn't know until late after that is that she's actually the daughter of the founding president of Lebanon. She's the daughter of Sharafuri and his diarist. So the world of the book, you know, Sextarianism is really situated and comes out in a world that's increasingly sectarian, has a sectarian feeling of politics, and has a, here, I need to like be able to see this, so I'm not looking. Okay. Where political difference is much more increasingly a felt kind of difference. It has very sharp contours, and it's another way of saying it's sectarian difference. And here, this is true globally, regionally, and between nation states, so geopolitically. This sectarian understanding of political difference often travels through sex and gender. What I mean by that is that people express more and more their political identity as wrapped around a politics of sex and gender. And this has become kind of a flashpoint in even talking about how political difference operates in the world. Now, when I say sectarian, I mean it in the fullness of its word, okay? I think sometimes when it comes to the Middle East, the usage of the word is narrow. We use it, and it's used about us, with a religious connotation, as if that's the only meaning of the word. But the word itself has a much broader circulation, and it's about, or it denotes forms of difference that are hard, like hardened forms of difference, okay, with clear boundaries. So, for example, people say, like, the United States is becoming an increasingly sectarian political system because the divisions are so stark. We're also in a world where more and more people are experiencing displacement and mass migration due to war, climate change, economic collapse. And everywhere people go, they inspire racial, civilizational, religious, and demographic anxieties. And you know, as these anxieties get sparked, there's often the hyper-securitization around sex as a way to deal with the you know, quote-unquote problem of difference. The book is really anchored in 3 different sets of academic literature: law, sovereignty, and state power, on sexual and political difference, and on the religious and the secular. And I try to build conversations between these 3 sets of literature, which often don't talk to each other a lot. So I know not everybody you know, may know a lot about Lebanon, but one of the things you may know is that people often think of it as an exceptional site. It's an exceptional site when it comes to the Middle East, and the Middle East itself becomes exceptional in the wider world. And I actually find that it's more exemplary of the problems that we just spoke about, these ongoing trends that are intensifying around the world, than exceptional. It has the highest number of family laws in the world. Family law is an arena of law that basically regulates the family, and every nation state has family law. And just for a sort of funny example, it has the highest number of family laws in the world, and the second highest is India. So Lebanon is about 7 million people total. About 4.5 million are citizens. And the country that comes after that is India, and after that is Israel, and that's not a coincidence. It has to do with much of the sort of ideologies of these two states, and these multiple states. And what that means is that political difference becomes wrapped around this idea of the multiplication of difference. And state power really is performed as the management of political difference. Now, this is kind of a well-worn argument in state theory, that sovereignty here is being expressed as that which can manage, mediate, transcend difference. And that's why I think Lebanon is kind of the perfect place to think about this question, because the raison d'etre of the state is to multiply difference. Lebanon also has the highest concentration of refugee, displaced persons in the world, meaning for every 3 people, this statistics may even be old, for every 3 citizens, there is 1 refugee or displaced person living in Lebanon. And of course, here you see, again, demographic anxiety, civilizational discourse, and a lot of this still clusters around sex and gender, conversations on sex and gender, and the securitization of sexuality. And when I say that, I actually mean of heterosexuality as it relates to birth patterns, all the good biopolitical stuff of the state, the securitization of heterosexuality and moral planets. And, you know, sometimes I know there's a replacement theory that people talk about in the context of Europe and how it inspires sort of right-wing populist movements. I know recently the new Prime Minister of Italy, for example, was elected the first female Prime Minister of Italy, is a proponent of replacement theory. And one of the things that I try to propose in the book is that Lebanon is a really wonderful place, terribly wonderful place to think about replacement theory from, because it begins in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from historic Palestine, and then from 1948 until today, you have the genesis of a replacement theory fear. Lebanon has also been at war with most of its time as a state. Most of its time as an independent state, it's been at war, either with Israel or itself, civil war. It's kind of a very full place to think about legal pluralism and legal intersections, colonialism, post-colonialism. Let's see. So this book is really an ethnography of the experience of the state, what the state feels like from a variety of different subject positions. The Cassation Court archives, which are high court archives. I don't know what the terminology in the Netherlands would be, but the highest court you have, that would be the Cassation Court in Lebanon. Activists, judges, lawyers, people who have experienced detention, religious converts, citizens and non-citizens, and researchers. And it employs archival, ethnographic, and feminist methods and tries to generate conversations between them. And it's really sort of, I offer 3 different concepts in this book. The first is sextarianism itself. And as a concept, it travels across different sites that include law and bureaucracy, the archives of court decisions as they relate to religious conversion, or the experience of converts, social movements, and finally, the regulation of sex and sexuality through courts and interrogation rooms. And there's 2 sort of companion concepts that are introduced in this book, the first being evangelical secularism, and the second being the epidermal state, the idea of an epidermal state. So, you know, through the concept of sextarianism, I try to, you know, the way the sort of term came to me, I had written something called Sex and Sectarian, I can't even say it anymore, Sex and Sectarianism. And I was in a workshop and I was listening to a bunch of brilliant people and it just kept turning in my mind. And I thought, oh, you know, we should just smush them together, Sextarianism. And it really, as a concept, theorizes how biopolitical citizenship is constituted through the regulation of sex and sexuality. And I think this perspective allows us to really highlight heterosexuality as a disciplined, securitized subject position and sort of regime of sexuality. And that's one of the things that I grew increasingly invested in, was trying to actually have a queer analysis of heterosexuality itself, to really treat it as an object that was also quite queer and quite constructed. And heterosexuality having very different stakes for men and women. And, you know, the concept kind of is a transnational concept, and the reason why it travels is because it focuses on aspects of the state, the nation state, that all states share regardless of location. That is law, bureaucracy, the structure of the state. And on the other hand, sort of foundational myths between the public and the private, on the one hand, and the religious and the secular. So, for example, it offers transnational frameworks for understanding the relationship between sovereignty, secularism, and violence in the United States, or India, or Iran. And I think that sometimes when you ask a well-worn question from new locations, you have new perspectives. And that's why sometimes you constantly have to ask the same question, but from a different location. So here, sexual difference is political difference, to repeat Carol Pateman's foundational claim and her revision of contract theory, liberal contract theory. But it's also a process, and I'm very careful about this. I really want it to be understood as a technology of state power itself, to make sexual difference, to produce sexual difference, not just to reflect it or manage it, but to make it. And here, I think it really allows us to study this construction of sexual difference from a colonial and post-colonial sort of location that highlights hypervisibility as a colonial technique of power. Colonial states, hypervisibility is a big sort of technology of securitization in colonial contexts. And then often as states transition into post-colonial contexts, it's the same state, right? Like there are many of the same sort of techniques, bureaucracies that remain in place. Sextarianism places personal status and family law in conversation with feminist and queer theory, and sovereignty's investment in sex is multiple. It manifests as the regulation of straight and queer sexualities and genders. When I use the term sexual difference, I really mean this kind of feedback loop between the construction of a gender binary and the construction of sexualities into discrete forms. And this also comes from, and I don't know if how many other people have felt this, but a lot of times when it comes to work on the Middle East, the question of sex or work on sex or work on sexuality is very much wrapped up in queer subjectivities. And I found that kind of frustrating. So what I wanted to do was kind of displace, like bring that critical gaze, I would say, or apparatus, to think about heterosexuality. Say, you know what, you're weird too. Like, let's try to figure you out. Because I think we've gotten very comfortable with what is normative and what is queer. The second concept that the book offers is evangelical secularism. And here, this is really activism that was aimed at transcending a culture of sectarianism, entrenched difference, into a culture of secularism. And it theorizes the pedagogical registers of activist movements that believe that cultural and social change must precede political change. This is something that social movements across the world often divide around. It's somehow when you see like a sort of radical political take versus a liberal political take, the question of what comes first. Do you change people's minds before you change the law? Or do you change the law because it's the right thing to do? In some ways, this was sort of inspired by MLK and Martin Luther King in his letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, the biggest enemy is actually liberals who keep telling you, not now, it's not time, people aren't ready. And that's the biggest enemy facing Black people at that time and still. So in Lebanon, what this looks like is saying you cannot change the political system. You cannot enter a non-sectarian system until people are no longer sectarian. And evangelical secularism was steeped also in this logic, this temporality of change. And it really drew on Islamic practices of religious activism, da'wah, for those that know the term, was steeped in a global missionary character of colonial and post-colonial state modernity. The idea that as empires travel, their mission is to create citizens ready for the state structure that the empire brings. And was also informed by the structural and ideological resonance of Christianity in Lebanon itself. In its laïc pride iteration, which is how what I focus on in that chapter, it also has a queer genealogy. So it was active, the sort of founders were inspired by queer pride marches, queer politics, the idea of the importance of public space, taking over public space. And actually, this is something that Islamist movements share, the importance of saturating public space with a different kind of moral cosmology. And it really denotes a kind of secularism that's an ethical project, that's about the practice of a self. What it means for secularism to become an identity, to be seen in civilization as a form of civilizational and cultural difference. These migrants they're not secular, so they don't fit in, for example. That's a claim, that's an identitarian claim. That's a civilizational discourse. And it's somewhere that something you hear all over Europe, in the Middle East itself, and particularly actually when I was thinking about this sort of identitarian way of understanding secularism, I was thinking about Egypt and what had happened in the aftermath of the uprising there. Now, if secularism and evangelical secularism was an ethical project, it is not the only form of secularism that is at play in this context. And I wanted to offer secularism as a plural, or the plural, that there's secular pluralism. There's more than one understanding and operation of secularism in any given context. That's precisely why the arguments get so heated around this subject. Because when you say a word like secularism, everyone assumes that they know what it means and that they agree, but actually have a conversation about it, and very quickly you will see that people don't agree actually what it is. Especially if you look at different state structures. So French secularism is very different than American secularism, which is very different than Turkish secularism, which is very different than Lebanese secularism. And I think Lebanon does offer a kind, a sort of, I don't want to say unique, but a different framework of secularism. And that was actually one of the chants in these big marches. They would say, neither French nor Turkish secularism, we want a Lebanese secularism. That was one of the chants. And we can go into, if anyone's really interested in this question of secularism, more in the Q&A. And because it was posed against state secularism. So if state secularism was about the management of difference, a classic kind of liberal way of understanding how states work, and finding sort of transcending all difference into a unified space called the citizen. Evangelical secularists found this definition of secularism and practice of it to be deficient and dangerous, precisely because it was not about a sense of self. It was just a system that functioned, okay? That it didn't have this. So, for example, if in the eyes of the state, to be a religious convert, all you have to do is fulfill the right paperwork. Okay, that's kind of the process of religious conversion in Lebanon. It's a bureaucratic form, and you have to fill it out, register it with the state. And what that means is that many people are converting between religions to make use of different laws, to make use of different family laws. So a Catholic may become an Orthodox Christian to get a divorce. A Shia Muslim may become a Sunni Muslim for inheritance reasons. Or a Christian may become a Muslim in order to get married more than once. Okay? So if in the eyes of the state, this is all fine, because the idea of secularism is that you can't look inside someone's soul. You can only follow bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the truth here, and it's what guarantees equality. Evangelical secularists saw this as a very kind of disturbing understanding of religion, what it meant, because it wasn't necessarily about sincerity. It was about bureaucracy and the need to convert. And evangelical secularism was very much about sincerity, internalization, and kind of the dignity of citizenship. So it was really actually aimed towards the state and changing the kind of state that Lebanon is, partly because there is a very old story, and it's told of a lot of post-colonial states, and Lebanon is not exceptional to this story, which is there is a narrative of a weak state. The state is absent. The state is weak. And evangelical secularists wanted to strengthen the state, wanted to build ways so that the state would become more sovereign and more powerful in some ways. And that's something that was repeated in the 2019 uprising that happened happening temporalities are strange, but certainly sparked 3 years ago. And one of the things that really concerned me here, and it sort of inspired this last chapter, was thinking, just because a state doesn't necessarily control the means of political violence, doesn't have a hegemony over the use of force, which is the most standard understanding of sovereignty, the Weberian understanding of sovereignty. Just because that is true, and it has always been true in the entire history of Lebanon, doesn't mean the state is not violent. The state is still incredibly violent, and it's very jealous over its use of violence. So instead of asking the question of where is the state, I wanted to ask the question, what is the state doing? Where is it exercising violence? Where is it performing this kind of sovereign violence? And to answer this question, if you're a queer person, or you're a refugee, or you're a drug user, and you're part of this 2019, or a migrant laborer, you're part of this 2019 protest, and all of a sudden the protest chant becomes for a strong state, what does that sound like to you from that position, right? How does it actually echo in your ears? And that's sort of what I offer here as the epidermal state. A way of understanding a state and how it performs its sovereignty by materializing the stakes of bodies, the materialization of bodies through violence and securitization. And it's also about how you feel the state, how the state is a felt object through violence. And here, the state, as it sort of turns inwards and exerts violence, it becomes a bounded object in and of itself. That's where you can see kind of the state as operating. It's kinetic, right? It's not something that is just there. It articulates itself as it acts. That's when it comes into being. This is kind of the Mitchell understanding here of the state. And it exerts this violence very, I would say, strategically. against people who are posed differently in political society across an economy of who can be violated and who can't, and how people can be violated and how they can't, and how the state actually can violate without committing violence, because the state gets to and can commit can commit violence without committing a violation, because it's actually what states, what the limits of violence are, right? So it can exert violence, and it does, but not all violence is a violation. And I think the term helps us really center sovereignty at this site of sex and sexuality. And it's also a way because one of the problems I had, and I'm sure this is a problem many of you have as you do your research, is that it's not as if places don't change. We might go do research and, our research ends, and the place that we did our research in is totally different by the time that you're sitting writing. So one of the things that happened was the Syrian uprising, which meant that 1.5 million Syrians came, in different phases, obviously. There are 1.5 million Syrians living in Lebanon. And the other thing that happened, of course, was the uprising. But when the Syrian uprising happened and its kind of displacement of people into Lebanon, political society, I had to find a language to think about political society that wasn't centered on citizenship, or at least saw citizenship as one of multiple kinds of statuses in a dynamic relation to each other. So an epidermal state becomes, to me at least, a way to think about political society through violence, violability, and the materialization of bodies in an intersectional way, but also very much in a way that's invested primarily in this status, the question of citizen, non-citizen. It's always very awkward talking about this book today, because we're okay. Because for anyone who is following the news, Lebanon is it's probably it's in a stage of kind of multiple crises, overlapping crises. And actually the court that a lot of the ethnography of the book is based on is now defunct. And it's defunct because it is the court hearing the case of the Beirut explosion, the explosion at the port. And because this explosion is so hot politically, politicians have paralyzed the court. So the court that the book is based on is not functioning right now. Nor are people even able to commute to work on a government salary anymore. That is how bad inflation is. So 80% of Lebanon lives in multidimensional poverty. And the official dollar peg 3 years ago was 1,500 liras to a dollar. Today it's 40,000. So we're talking really about a kind of, and I think it's interesting to think of research as kind of an artifact, because as soon as it comes out, it becomes an object of its own, but it's also an object that ceases to represent any time and place. It sort of takes on this identity as an artifact, I would say. Okay.
Can I have 5 more minutes? Or?
No, I can, I could, okay. So this is, Lebanon, but then you have the world today, where you have sort of intensifying sectarian divides geopolitically and within nation states. And you have also the mapping of the secular religious divide onto this question of culture and difference and movement of people, what it means to be in a political society that is increasingly highly diffuse, and that is going to increasingly look like what the world is like, a sort of fortress where Europe crumbles. If one of the ways of dealing with it was fortress Europe, new tactics have to be put in place, and they are continuously being created and deployed. And most of the time, a lot of this discourse of difference continues to travel through sex. through, if it's their men are different, right? Like they don't know how to be in political society with women who are quote unquote liberated. Is one way of thinking about that. Another way of thinking is these people have too many children. It's a problem. What are they teaching their children at home? Does it fit with our society? Do we need to send them to education camps, which a lot of states run? And this, unfortunately, is something, the conversation, I think, is misanchored in Europe. This conversation is happening everywhere in the world. It's happening in Kenya, it's happening in Lebanon, it's happening everywhere where there is huge amounts of displaced people crossing borders. In some way, the focus on Europe is a little racist, maybe, I would say. And of course, and we see this today in Iran, for example, political uprisings across continue to unfold at the site of the body. Both uprisings and the putting down of those uprisings continue to, and here you definitely see the last 13 years, it's beginning 13 years in the Middle East, but it also has a longer genealogy, and it will continue to this sort of focus on the body as the site of both politics and anti-politics, I would say, or anti-state policies and state policies of securitization and regulation. I'll end here, and then because I have more of it.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nasreen, for inviting me to respond to Maya's book. Thank you, Maya, for the book talk, and more importantly, thank you for writing this book. I think it's really wonderful to see this book in the world for many reasons. As you know, I think myself and many like me, I think have been kind of waiting for this book in order to sort of help us to navigate the messy maze of the legal and the political infrastructure of Lebanon. So this is a book that we have been waiting for. And it is the first book, as you've mentioned, to provide a thorough and critical diagnosis of what you call sextarianism, a concept that allows us to understand the entanglement of sexual and political sectarian difference at the heart of the state's display and practice of power and sovereignty. Today, as you showed us, sextarianism is not confined to Lebanon, but is a global phenomenon. And you just mentioned, especially if we engage more broadly with sect beyond its religious connotations, to understand the ways in which nation states and geopolitical camps instrumentalize sexual politics legally, bureaucratically, and politically for claims of security and sovereignty. I will not spend a lot of time actually talking about the concept of sextarianism as such. You, in the book, you've set out to explore it as it is articulated bureaucratically, legally, and ideologically in Lebanon, and you've kind of gone through that more broadly today in the book talk. But what I want to focus on is two concepts. What I want to run into are two concepts that you mentioned earlier are companion concepts to sextarianism, and these are evangelical secularism and the equitarian state. So my questions will predominantly be will emerge from your theorization of these two concepts. And I will provide a little bit of some background to the arguments that frame these concepts for you, for those who have not read the book, so that the questions might kind of come across as a bit too long, but at least it will give you a bit of a kind of a background for the arguments that frame these concepts. So please bear with me. I will read my questions. In chapter 3, entitled, "Are You Going to Pride, Evangelical Secularism and the Politics of the Law?" you present a very convincing and thorough diagnosis of secular activism in Lebanon, more specifically looking at liberal secular discourse that emerged from social movements such as the Laïc Pride or secular pride. The chapter critiques the reformist underpinnings of such a project, whose campaigns and demands called for the addition of civil marriage courts or personal status laws and the removal of sectarian and religious identifications from individual census documents. This, you clearly outline, is a project that aims to spread a culture of secularism and cultivate this notion of the modern Lebanese subject, rather than, and you mentioned this earlier, dismantling the political sectarian infrastructure of the state. More importantly, what you introduce in your diagnosis of secular activism in Lebanon is a conceptual tool you call evangelical secularism that helps us think about this secular project, how this secular project evinces a certain being in the world that foregrounds the ethics of the self and the ethics of the secular subject, and that is also set against a sectarian subject. That is, this is a version of secularism. Evangelical secularism is understood by its proponents as superior because it foregrounds a progressive regime of sexual difference and espouses liberal ideals such as freedom of choice and equality. You show how this actually ends up producing a new hierarchy of sextarian difference, because those who opt to adopt the secular alternative and those who continue to be regulated by, because it creates kind of a difference, sectarian difference between those who adopt the secular alternative and those who continue to be regulated by sectarian laws of the existing marriage and personal status law. One thing that struck me is that despite activists' clear articulation of their secular vision, one they see as strictly separate from religious and sectarian command of the law, you chose the term evangelical to describe their vision of secularism, a term that is very much rooted in Christianity. Could you please further elaborate on the decision to use this term? Also, you argue that such an evangelical secularism operates within what you call a liberal temporality of redemption, in contradiction to the radical temporality of socialist and communist radical feminist groups that called for a complete dissolution and rooting out of sectarianism at all levels, especially during the 2009 revolution. So can you please elaborate on these different temporalities of activist work, and more specifically on what you mean by the redemptive character of evangelical secularism? So why evangelical secularism? What about the kind of different temporalities of activist work, and what is this redemptive character of evangelical secularism? I will go on to the second question. So that's the first question. The second question I have pertains to the final chapter of the book. In this chapter, you look at the ways in which state power and sovereignty are performed and materialized on bodies along the axis of sexual difference. You introduce the term epidermal state to explore such workings of power. By looking specifically at hymen and anal examinations, the chapter shows how the state regulates and consolidates the truth of sex and sexuality through the regulation and violation of gender and racialized bodies. For those who do not know, both hymen and anal exams are performed to test penetrative sex, which is deemed unlawful, so premarital sex or sex between men. Here you look at two examples, that of Hannah and Ramzi, whose divorce dispute demanded that Hannah underwent a hymen exam, and that despite the lack of proof of premarital sex, the personal status court decision was initially ruled in her favor, which initially ruled in her favor was eventually revoked by the plenary assembly, exposing the patriarchal privilege of the medical legal security apparatus of the state that ended up protecting Ramzi, the partner. The second example the chapter discusses is that of Basil, a young Syrian man who was accused of performing unnatural sex and detained in 2010, and the bodily violence and intimidation he and his visitors, Yasmin and Rola, were subjected to by the internal security forces officers. The cases show, you argue, and I quote, how queer and straight sexualities are not separate spheres of regulation and secularization, but that they are regulated and constituted in relation to each other, a relation that is grounded in gender dimorphism, but also the boundaries of citizenship and the lack thereof. In those two cases, you show how bodies that fail along the axis of sexuality, gender, and citizenship, as in the case of Basil, are the constitutive outside of the state's sovereignty and the sovereignty of its body politic, here represented by the figure of the heterosexual male citizenry. Having said that, The chapter, although subtly, sets these cases of Hannah and Ramzi and Bassett, Yasmin and Rilla against the backdrop of the emergence in 2006 of a new ruling by the Lebanese misdemeanor court that states that the Penal Code 534 does not apply to gay sex anymore, and that gay sex is not unnatural. Whilst recognizing this as a victory for gay rights, you, and rightly so, point out that migrant and refugee communities remain particularly vulnerable to this definition of unnatural sex. I wanted here to probe you a little bit further on this. Do these changes in the 534 Penal Code account to the emergence of a new sphere of regulation, legal, social, and sexual, that offers protection or possibly consent to a certain type of gay masculinity along the axis of class, gender, and citizenship? And if so, where does this sphere of regulation feature in relation to the spheres you've already mapped out that regulate, intimidate, and violate the frail bodies of women, queer, and racialized? Does class and citizenship feature as vectors of protection and regulation of a legally, socially, and sexually consented gay masculinity? Should we start with those two questions and then, or should I continue? the second
Now let's start here.
Let's start here?
Let's
Okay.
start here.
Okay.
Very, very small questions. Thank you. This is like amazing read of the book. Okay. So I will say in earlier iterations of the work, it was called Dawa secularism. It wasn't called evangelical secularism. I changed it later. And the reason why I went with the term evangelical is because I really wanted to get at that specific, like spreading the good word, right? Spreading the word, which is a much more actually Christian understanding of than Muslim understanding of what it means to change the world around you and to convert people, basically, how to convert people. And I thought it was a more accurate depiction. And I didn't want to, so I think the term evangelical allows me to, first of all, really underscore the fact that this is an ethical project. It's a project of the self, right? It's a project that's aimed at, in some ways, this actually mirrors the difference between conversion, understandings of conversion and Christianity and Islam. Because in Islam, and this is something I heard over and over again doing my research, from people, Muslim sheikhs in charge of conversion, which is that, it's not our business to look at your soul. That's not what we do here. What we do here is like, you said it, I heard it, boom, you're a Muslim, right? And you would go to a Christian priest and be like, what about, and they'd like, take this class, and you have to do this, and you have to accept this as you're this, and really, and there's the part of that is because there's a different relationship that clergy have in these two different religions. And the kind of secularism that I was studying was more about the internal state, right? More about sort of changing your sense of self. And there was an almost staging of political difference, of political fights, of political activism, where, it's like first you must change yourself, and it's like the most sincere thing you could do, and it's a deeply felt thing. So I think the term evangelical allowed me to get at this ethical understanding of activism. And it also allowed me to tie in the very particular resonance of Christianity in Lebanon, historically, and including today how when people discuss radical change, like you were saying, there's always kind of the specter of religious balance. This is what it animates. It animates like the problem, the question of religious minorities, right? If the majority of the state, and this was exactly the French colonial understanding as well, right? It's kind of repeated. If the majority of the state is Muslim, the majority of citizens are Muslim, and you remove a system where it's very clear, like the president has to be Christian, this, and parliament has to be 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. If you remove that, you're going to end up with a Muslim government, a Muslim majority government. That was sort of how Lebanon was founded in some ways, as the only place in the region that would be about religious pluralism, religious freedom, and the explicit political empowerment of Christianity in the region. And this is something that today still haunts this question of radical change versus, if you get rid of the system now, what will happen to religious diversity, right? And the shadow of that is, if Christians lose political power, will they stay? This is kind of a very small synopsis of what the political debate looks like. And that is important then to really bring in this genealogy and anchor it in a Christian, because this was when people in these meetings would get into fights. And anyone who's ever worked in like a big coalition of social movements, people fight a lot, right? They fight all the time. And then you find like the least common denominator that everyone can still sit in a room together. And the least common denominator was corruption and this idea of a civil marriage law, a separate law. Because the specter of sectarian balance, and I would say sextarian balance, still haunted this debate over temporality and change. And then the final way of thinking about the evangelical is because I think the state itself is a missionary. The nation state has a kind of missionary characteristic, particularly if you think about colonialism and you think about the sort of civilizational discourse of colonialism, and what in the Middle East, at least, these mandates were supposed to do, French and British mandates, what they were supposed to do. And what they were supposed to do, and that's why people, not me, but some people consider it like diet colonialism light, right? Is that they were supposedly supposed to prepare citizenships for independence, make people into citizens. At which time they, these colonial powers were like, "Oh, you're ready. Bye-bye. I'm leaving now. I did my job. See you later. Came back to France." Obviously, this didn't happen.
Which resonates a bit with the missionary
Exactly.
project
These are
of
missionary projects.
secularism, of producing the modern kind of
state citizen.
The modern citizen.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's almost an exact sort of resonance, right? Where the idea is like, well, you can't remove political sectarianism yet because we're not citizens yet, because we're too sectarian. And I think what this kind of temporality of politics does is actually secures and projects the nation state itself into the future, constant future, because it's also always something we're running towards. So it never ends. It also contains our political imagination into this form.
A redemptive, future-orientated temporality, as you call it.
Yeah. Like we will be better.
Yes.
That's the sort of logic.
Yeah.
We will always become better. And when we look to the past, we will see that what we did wrong, right? Like, because it's both past and future oriented. Okay, so epidermal state after that. I think that by posing the hymen exam and the anal exam together, I wanted to bring home this idea that if you study sexuality itself, the state is actually interested in sexuality itself before it becomes sexualities, right? Because its primary interest is in materializing the states of sex and gender before they become discrete objects almost, or that there's a process of producing them as discrete objects, partly through violence and partly through then determining what what body gets what test, right? So, and the test ends up in some ways having an active role in the state's eyes in determining your gender, right? So you will get this test, which means the state thinks you're a woman, right? In the eyes of the state, you're a woman. So the hymen means this, it is located in these places. And I just want to say, hymen and anal exams are a global phenomenon. If anyone has heard of a rape kit, that's what a hymen, it includes a hymen exam, right? These are highly medicalized terms. When doctors in Lebanon use and perform these tests, it's also part of like an international circulation of medical knowledge. Okay. Same thing when there's a allegation of assault between men, right? They do perform a test, but what they're testing for is different. So the technology is the same, but what they're looking for might be different, right? Although they will use these tests in cases of assault in Lebanon. Like assault, for example, allegations of sort of assault against a child, they will conduct an anal exam, right, or a hymen exam. So these are sort of global, at least technologies, medical technologies and medical forms of expertise that circulate. And here, I think legal change, the question of the 534 law, and what I wanted to show is that the sexual injury and sexual rights are much broader and cannot be captured by any kind of legal campaign, and can never be ameliorated through the removal or reform of any legal code. In fact, sometimes it just creates more problems. I'm not saying that the code shouldn't be removed. I think it should be removed. But what happened in Lebanon is that this misdemeanors court said, oh, okay, you can't charge this person anymore because gay sex is no longer unnatural. Because the code says nothing about gay sex. It says something about unnatural sex. So if the interpretation changed, but the law stayed on the books. So maybe S&M is still unnatural, right? BDSM, like the interpretation of what the unnatural is becomes the substance here. Not the fact that the state has no right, like who are you to say what's natural, unnatural, natural? And here you see two sides of the same coin, public morality and public order, right? And again, these are concepts that all states construct and sort of have codes for public morality and public order. And I wanted to really show how, in some ways, because there was a big campaign, a successful campaign against anal exams, or a somewhat successful campaign in Lebanon, and it was a global campaign. HRW put out a report, but every time I would go to these queer meetings, these activist meetings with lawyers, and I would say, oh, this is wonderful. Like, what about hymen exams? Shouldn't we get rid of that too? The answer was always, oh, we can't do that. It's too complicated. This is not the right time to do it now. There's too many people involved. You have to sometimes people ask for a hymen exam, right, to prove their virginity. So it's too messy, it's too difficult. It's not the time to do it. So I became very fascinated by this, what the vanguard of sexual rights was, right? How it was being produced. And it was being produced within a very particular gendered architecture that repeated many of the sextarian sort of discourses and the hyper-securitization of women's bodies through the hymen. And all of this is obviously about the public fiction of virginity, ultimately, and the public fiction of the hymen.
So it's also very privatized, and that's why there's a kind of it's too messy. It's a family.
You can't touch it, right? With an anal exam, you know who the enemy is. It's the state. With a hymen exam, it's way too complicated because there's too many people, right? So who's the enemy here? Which is another way of saying hymen exams are more popular. More widespread. So I became very interested in this impasse, which is why I wanted to think about then sexual regulation as a whole. Yeah.
Thank you for these responses. I think you've kind of brought up a lot of points that could be raised later through the Q&A, but I'm particularly interested in this notion of sexual rights that cannot be captured by any legal campaign or legal reform, but maybe this is something to discuss later.
Over dinner. Over dinner conversation.
Over dinner. But I have two more questions. They're a bit shorter and hopefully more direct.
Sorry,
I'm enjoying listening to you. The third question I have relates to the methodology you follow in your research, and I'm particularly interested in the archival and ethnographic work that you conducted. You state that you built an archival ethnographic theory that, and I quote, centers the life world and knowledge production of archivists, end quote, and the archives themselves, as you show later in the chapter. And you work on a site which is the Court of Cassation, that was destroyed by a fire in the Lebanese Civil War. And working on that site, you kind of expose the relationship between what you call violence and history making. And you suggest that the archival destruction itself called for a process of recuperation, or a process of dwelling in absence as a site of abundance, right? I thought that was very interesting and illuminating. And you said that these conditions demanded from you to lose control over the research. Can you please further elaborate on this methodology and maybe the limits and potentialities of critical archival research, such a method in acts?
Sure. So the context here is that, like any good graduate student, I went and I was like, I know what I want to do. Like, I know what I'm looking for. And then like any good graduate student, you realize that you have no idea what the hell you're doing. Once you talk to somebody and you're no longer in a room thinking about your smart questions, right? But you actually have to like engage in the world, and people tell you that's a dumb question. You have to be like, oh, okay, it's a dumb question. Let me rethink this. So I came up with this sort of idea because of sort of the archive and how to, and to me it's a feminist method. I was trained as an anthropologist, and I was trained in part by historical anthropologists. So I always had a sort of framework, I would say, that was about archival ethnography, historical ethnography. And one of the things I realized when I started doing my research was that I wasn't in charge. Like, the image of what you think you're going to do is really not. First of all, it's highly contingent on who you are and the circumstances that you find yourself in. I happened to meet the head of the Shura Council, the State Shura Council, at a law event where I was getting my graduate degree in New York. He came, I asked him a question, we had a fight. I was invited to dinner with him. We started talking. We laughed a lot, right? Like, that's how I ultimately got into this archive. And then when I actually went to visit the archive, I found out that the archivist of this high court was my aunt's neighbor. So we're from sort of the same part of Beirut, which is, I mean, it's maybe too much detail, but it's a very particular part of Beirut, let's just say. So it's highly contingent on the circumstances you find yourself in. And I'm always kind of disturbed by theoretical approaches that are sealed, that kind of pretend that replication is possible, right? Regardless of who's doing it in any given setting. So it's highly contingent. And then when I got there, the archivists themselves kept showing me cases. Because I went and I said, they were like, what do you do? And I was like, this is what I'm interested in. But what do you think? Clearly, you're an archivist. You've been doing this for many, many years. Like, what do you think I should see to understand how the state works? So they know, right? So they started showing me these cases. And that's actually many of the cases in the book are what they shared with me. So I don't think anybody's work is possible without collaboration. And this became kind of a feminist method of decentering authorship, or rethinking what an author is and how knowledge is produced as part of an assemblage of things that includes things like contingency, or there's no electricity today, there's a power cut, it's really hot, nobody wants to go to work, or you do go to work, everybody's sweating, and that informs the scene and maybe changes things in innumerable ways that you can't figure out. And the other part of that kind of decentering authorship is also, I think sometimes as scholars, now as professors, when we train graduate students, and I train graduate students in feminist methods, where I work, and I like teaching that class. It's really important to not reproduce the myth of meritocracy. Like, if you just try hard enough, you'll get the right research done, right? And the book that has the best research is because the person tried really hard and they really deserved, right? Like, they just did something. A lot of it is chance. A lot of it is contingency. And it cannot be replicated because it is contingent. And I think it's important to share that. To not reproduce the academy as a meritocracy as it gets completely destroyed. And it becomes very obvious that the academy is not a meritocracy.
And what about social dwelling in the absence of really
Yeah.
in that, and how you kind of destruction as a site of abundance? I was very interested in how you theorize that and what you meant by that in terms of your archival research. And so it's, how did you deal with the fact that actually there was a limitation to what you can access in terms of the files? And,
So I didn't even know there had been a fire until people told me.
I see.
Right, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not someone who, and it's not like public knowledge. It's not something that is public knowledge, in Lebanon, that the highest court's archives have been burned. And they were burned 40 years ago and have yet to be restored or in some way, right? Nothing is digitized, it's on paper. So if you think about it, it's this sort of perfect, dramatic story. Like, you're going into the archive, it's the high court, but it's burned. You don't even know. And it was burned during a war, and it hasn't yet been, but it's always on people's minds. What they can and can't find is always operationalized in the law. Because once you get to the high court, right, it's a citational logic. It's very much like academic knowledge production. It exists by citation. And it has to also project into the future. So it has to have the possibility of being a citation in a future case, right? To be a high court decision. It's jurisprudence. So how do you operate in this kind of legal system when so many of the files are gone, right? And yet people operate, law functions. And what you can't know becomes just as important as what you can know. And it's not an empty site. It's a very active site, because, what I narrate here is that people end up having to actually talk about, like, do you remember that case? Yeah, I remember that case. Do you remember what this judge said about that case? And that becomes, and it's in some ways, it's a very honest way of thinking about how the relationship of memory to law, lying to law, right? Truth is not the same as law. And then the importance of narrative and multiplicity becomes incredibly important. And this is something that I think we really dwell on in our own Lebanon, because we don't have an official narrative of history. Our history books end in 1943. They end with independence, right? Since then, there's been 2 civil wars, 3 wars with Israel, 2 occupations by Israel, the sort of Syrian hegemony. None of this exists in a history book, okay? And that's only the grand narratives. Imagine the granularity of things that don't exist. So we dwell in this constantly. Even if you think about the war, like, the war is everywhere around us, but it's nowhere in our knowledge, in our actual knowledge. So then multiplicity becomes incredibly important. The act of remembering becomes very important. The act of, because it's true in your heart, like, okay, it's not in a history book, but I know it happened. So this play of what isn't there and what that means, I think, and we were talking about this yesterday in terms of, like, queer histories, right? What it means to be, to have history sort of weaponized against you in that way, when you know in your heart that just because there's no record doesn't mean it didn't happen.
That's a perfect way to move to my last question, because I think we're running out of time, and we'd like to get some questions from the audience. I want to ask, my final question really is about, what I felt your book and the context of Lebanon teaches us is that a feminist political consciousness cannot not be grounded in knowledge of the law.
Mm.
And here, not just in terms of like a struggle for rights or freedom of choice, equality, and so on, but actually the knowledge of how to navigate and contest these kind of legal and political infrastructure of the state. And looking at your book, the book comes across as a valuable resource for activists working at the intersection between feminist queer politics and the law. It is interdisciplinary in nature, and it makes it accessible to scholars and students working in queer studies, gender studies, Middle East studies, but also, and more importantly, critical legal studies. And I'm genuinely in awe at the clarity and the nuance of your legal language, especially as someone who's not trained in law, per se. So I really think this is such a laborious process and a laborious project, and I'm really baffled by how you did it, you know? Yeah.
I'm a sucker for punishment. I like punishment. Okay, so when I was framing the project, first I never wanted to work in Lebanon when I was doing my graduate studies. And then I said, okay, if I'm gonna work on Lebanon, I wanna do something that I don't know anything about, because I don't want to sort of think I know what I'm talking about while not knowing what I'm talking about. And that was obviously also a misperception of a lot of things. But, and I've always been very attracted to the law partly because of the persistent belief in its unimportance in some ways in Lebanon, right? Like the judiciary is just this place that is like corrupt and it doesn't function. And it's kind of a persistent belief. And as a queer person, I obviously knew that was not true. And also, I have to say, like, my sister works in drug rehabilitation, like, and so I definitely knew that when the state was, law in the state definitely was there. And so, but I knew nothing about it. So I ended up asking a lot of questions. And I took classes at the law school where I got my PhD, so Columbia University Law School. And my department at the time actually ran sessions between anthropology and the law school. There was co-taught classes, where all we did was read Supreme Court decisions. So you learn how to read. And if you learned how to read a Lebanese Supreme Court decision, you can read one in the Netherlands, because these are modular forms. They're already an international form of expertise that circulate, right? So it's the same, like if you can read a French Court of Cassation, you can read an American one, because they always kind of have similar structures. So I learned how to read legal decisions. And then when I started doing my research, I attended law classes at the Lebanese University. And many of the people that I was working with were lawyers, because lawyers play a very active role in legal activism. So they told me where to go, what books to buy, and I asked them for their syllabi. What do you learn in law school? What's like introduction to, I don't know, family law? What books do they assign you? And so then I went to those libraries and bought those books and read them.
I always feel like the law is this, terrain that I find too complicated to kind of delve into. But you managed to kind of bring the law kind of to life in such a way that makes it accessible. Yeah, I mean, in a very painfully pleasurable way. Reading this book was both painful and pleasurable in the sense that, you see what kind of restrictions and what the limitations and the misuse of the law can look like in Lebanon in particular. Yeah. On that note,
and I think you do need, like, I do think feminist politics requires a legal knowledge, and also because law appears like this big thing, right? So sometimes when you read a law, you're like, oh, this is the law. But law, like every other social fact, is flexible and highly contingent, and you could have a bad lawyer, you could have a good lawyer, you could have whatever. Someone could find this reference, could not find that reference. And knowledge of the law is empowering in part way because it cuts down its power, right? Like it's also like a big social fiction. Like why is the law the law? Because it's the law. right? Like, there's a tautological understanding of law.
Yes, thank you so much, Maya, for the brilliant talk. Thank you, Layal, for the reflections and the questions. So now we can open the floor for
15 minutes.
So maybe, yeah, maybe we can stay until like 1:45.
We started a little late.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe also we can also start by clarification questions. And we can collect more questions and then Maya can answer. Anyone has questions?
I have many questions. Yes.
Jimmy starts off.
Okay, I can start. So I had a whole set of questions around the concept of sextarianism, especially concerning the fact that it seems to me that it's a very specific concept, right? That's why a new concept. But at the same time, you constantly, and I haven't read the book, so this is based on this talk, just to make it clear. It seems to me that constantly you also try to expand the reach of the concept, right? So I have a number of questions around that, but the first perhaps is about one of the first definitions you gave about the concept, which is a way of naming a word where political difference is felt more sharply, more intensely. And I was wondering whether there's something more to say about how it is felt, not just the fact that it is felt sharply. Because if we stay only with this very large definition, like a word in which political difference is felt sharply, first of all, I wonder whether that's really an accurate description of the whole world, right? For example, if you think about Cold War scenarios and the end of history or whatever, there are actually other moments in time where people could say political difference was felt much more sharply than now, right? So perhaps it's something about how it is felt, I wonder. And I was also wondering, so from some of what you said and also the discussion with Layal, I felt there was a sort of implication that the polarization of the political field, or this idea of feeling political differences sharply, is almost a problem in itself. Whereas that, for example, is how I, or some people understand the political, right? That politics is where you can build a polarization within the social field, so to say. So, for example, when you described the secular politics of, the movement that you called evangelical secular, and you said that ends up reproducing a new sectarian difference between those who adhere to that ideology. But that's how politics works, as I understand it, right? So is political polarization a problem in itself, you think, or,
I'm not making a normative argument about political polarization. I do think that there's something interesting happening around political polarization and how it travels through conversations on sex and sexuality. So how people will express a lot of their political identity on how they feel about or what they think about certain subjects that have to do with sex and sexuality. Whether it's, it used to be, I guess, gay marriage, but that's over, right? So there's new frontiers where people describe their differences and come into being and identify self and other through what they think about certain flashpoints around sex and sexuality. In the United States, this might look like abortion, and right now it looks increasingly like the targeting of trans people and the deployment of trans people as this litmus test around political difference, right? And this is, of course, a new spin on an old discourse, like you're saying. The woman question used to play this role for many, many years. And, I think everybody at this point knows that you're the first to be tokenized and the first to be abandoned, right? So you're the first to be tokenized as the sort of embodiment of this political polarization, and the first to be abandoned when deals are made across polarization. And I think that's probably true of a lot of members of vulnerable groups, but there's something specific about sex that keeps coming up. So I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon. What I do think that there is a intensity of, and maybe this is because I've been living in the United States too long, where there's also a intensity to the point of people not wanting to talk to each other, where actually this myth of this public space or the public sphere where all the differences get hashed out and then yay, we've moved on to something, there's a consensus, is being limited, very much so. Partly because how political difference in a sort of neoliberal order where identity is also like a highly curated and commodified subject position. So a lot of times when you have a political debate with, it'll be like, well, this makes me feel this way, right? Well, who cares how you tell me what you know, right? So there's that, but also that means when you come, so people express themselves even in a political argument oftentimes through the trope of feeling. And it's deployed as a shield sometimes or as a weapon. But I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I just think there's something interesting happening with the multiplication of these discourses. And in terms of whether it's specific or not as a concept, I think all theories are specific until they aren't. There's no theory that doesn't begin somewhere. It's just that some places speak the language of the world and are allowed to speak the language of the world and others aren't. So there's no theory that's not specific. It's just some specificities are not seen as particular. That's the difference. It's kind of like when, and I always do this, like when you teach Foucault in your class, I always try to teach Hercule and Barbin because I'm like, see, there's a place, there's a document, there's a location. He was doing something, he was talking about a specific context before you're like, detach it from everything and mobilize it around the world.
Any other questions?
Wow, everything was super clear, huh? No question.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you for your talk. It was lovely. A lot of the things that you brought up were new to me, particularly to Lebanon and its politics and stuff. And I was wondering throughout the talk, getting a bit more of an idea of what the country looks like now. And the thing you said about removing legal restrictive laws will not, by definition, ameliorate sexual rights. But thinking of the country being like with a frozen court, the poverty and like multidimensional, of wars and everything, to what extent is it still possible or to remove those legal or restrictive laws? Is there still some movement, or is it just that being stuck in this frozen phase?
That's a good question. I don't think we know yet. But I think that what the example of Lebanon does give us, and it's not always a sad example, is that people live through tragedy, people live through crises, people live through war, they don't just die, and they find ways to live. And living can become incredibly creative and productive during these times of violence. And I think it's important to say again and again, the majority of the world lives in insecurity. Right? This is not something where the question of war is over, right? Like, so for example, the war in Europe, now people are like, war? I thought we were done with that, right? This is the particular story about war. This is not the norm, actually. The norm is the hyper possibility of political violence, war, displacement, the erosion of a lot of or you could say in some ways, the expectation of stability is the not norm. Let's put it that way. And when you start to think that way, then you realize actually there's a lot of people have to be creative and resourceful. And to me, it's very important to always stress that these are tragic stories, but there are also stories that not only should be told, but that create worlds. And those worlds need to be taken seriously. And that knowledge, that tactical knowledge of living in a world that's falling apart is a resource. And it will continue to be a resource more and more as we move on. So I'm sure that political and legal activism will continue around. And I know actually people are still fighting these fights to remove certain laws, particularly around labor laws now. Yeah. Yes.
I haven't read the book again, so maybe my questions might seem a little bit out of place, but you were mentioning the different sectarianisms that get installed in the mindset when you were talking about evangelical sectarianism and talking about how your first initial idea was called the Tao secularism. And maybe looking into it, what kind of differences would you pull on in when you're talking about U.S. secularism, and French secularism and Turkish secularism, and the differences of what those could mean when someone's talking about the Lebanese secularism?
That's a great question. Well, this is like a very long literature, right, on secularism. But to like do it dirty and quick and dirty. You know, like France is seen as kind of freedom from religion. That's the way it models itself, right? The United States is a kind of freedom to have religion, right, and the multiplication of religion. So a lot of the things that you might see in France, for example, like this whole debate over the hijab, you would not see it in the United States. It wouldn't happen. And that's because how secularism is practiced is different. I mean, at least you wouldn't see it from the state's perspective, partly because you'd see all the Christian fundamentalists freaking out over this, right? Because they'd see it actually also as an attack on them. Even if they're Islamophobic, they would still probably see this as a problem. And I think Turkey as a model is a sort of secularism that comes through authoritarianism. And the Lebanese model is a little, it's very much anchored in pluralism. And it's anchored in the right to pluralism and to pluralism as an ideal that people are very attached to. Like the ideal sort of political society is one that has to maintain its pluralism. So the investment in secularism is also linked to the question of violence and civil war in a way that is not necessarily, and it's informed by these very high stakes. In a way that it's not informed in the United States or France or Turkey. Because in the shadow of this conversation is a threat of war. And everyone sort of lives with this knowledge that violence and non-violence exist on a spectrum.
Can I do a follow-up? Because you're talking about pluralism, I thought that could be an interesting bridge to what you mentioned as well, over the stereotype of the states being weak and it's needing to fortify itself in a way. And don't you think that, like, how does pluralism play a role in this incapacity to rule or this incapacity to sovereign?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of like the Turkish, you know, like there's too much difference here. Like, you know, we need to have sameness to have like this very strong, fierce state. The Lebanese obviously is a very different idea of pluralism and of religious freedom. I don't know if it's linked to I think the quote unquote weakness of the state is linked to things that are much less structural, or maybe they are structural, but they're easy, like they're simpler. It's freaking corruption, right? It's like totally warlords after a civil war coming into the state and ransacking it and deciding that they're not going to not only pass laws, but actually practice the laws that were passed as the peace settlements. So I think in some ways, the powers that be might be like, the problem is structural, right? We need to rearrange the structure. That's the weakness of the state. And that's because they want to keep being parasites on the state. And that's kind of how the system is functioning.
For the sake of time, we have just one more question.
One more question. I have a question. Yeah.
I just wanted to come back to the French model you speak about. It's I come from France, and the debate from the Iraq is not really about, from what I saw, it's not really in the freedom to don't see origin or etc. It's more Catholic people using the excuse of non-origin states to discriminate Muslim people.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's under in this shimmer or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's first of all, secularism we have to take seriously as a historical formation. And because different parts of the world have different histories, then the kinds of secularism that get practiced are different. So if you think about the history of France and the Catholic Church, and the genesis of secularism through that history of violence and power struggle between the Catholic Church and the state, and how the state emerges as an apparatus, in some ways in contradistinction to the Catholic Church. That is a very different history than the American narrative of secularism, which is fleeing. I mean, obviously they're settlers, right? This is a genocide, but of fleeing religious persecution in Europe to the United States to found a freedom of religion. Right, like a place where we can go be radical Christians, and we're not going to be whatever for it. And the Turkish and Lebanese histories here are very interesting because they're a similar history with very different outcomes. They come from an Ottoman history of pluralism, where, and this is interesting for France because in the Ottoman system of pluralism, there was religious pluralism and there was a religious center, and the religious center was Sunni Islam. And that got to determine what other religions were as minorities. And to a large extent, the Turkish answer to this was to, kind of create an authoritarian state and an attempt to make sameness at the state constitution. The Lebanese French answer, what the French mandate did in Lebanon when they came, is they made a very critical difference here. They said, okay, religious pluralism, but guess what? Sunni Islam is one sect among many. You're no longer the empty center. You're no longer the place that recognizes. You are recognized as different. And these are this is why history really matters. If you agree that history matters, then this informs that secularism is not just something you read about as a theory. It emerges in specific contexts, and then it gets articulated through very specific debates like the hijab in France.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question, but yeah, I think we're out of time. Maybe I will ask.
Oh, we're really, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So yes, thank you so much, Maya. Thank you so much, Layal. Thank you everyone for being here. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.